The sphenoid bone is the bone in the skull that sits directly behind the nose. So the biggest view of it will be from the superior view looking down into the top of the skull. If we look at the face, we'll be able to see parts of it. But just to kind of orient ourselves, the nose is kind of the anterior portion. This bone is going to make the core of the nose, and we'll go over it next. The sphenoid bone sits directly behind that. So it sort of makes the back portion of the nose and is really shaped like a winged creature or a moth, which is what sphenoid means. And this is the disarticulated version of the sphenoid bone here. So you can really start to see kind of a mythical moth or winged creature that a little fairy might ride. And I'm kind of encouraging that visualization because this area right here at the very top of the sphenoid bone is shaped like a saddle that a fairy might sit on to ride this mythical creature that has big wings. And this feature is called the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle. Anatomists thought it looked like a saddle as well. And this is where your pituitary gland sits, kind of surrounded by bone and very protected. It's your main endocrine gland controlling a lot of body functions. We'll learn about it when we learn about the brain. But if we go back over here to the articulated skull, and I kind of hold it up at an angle, the sella turcica is right in the center of the sphenoid bone, and the pituitary gland sits in that little seat of the saddle, if you will. Then the wings of our winged creature. So the greater wings are the lateral wings. They both go laterally, so that might be not the best way to say it, but the greater wings are the larger portions of the wings on either side of the sella turcica. And then the lesser wings are forming this ridge at the front. So to me, the lesser wings look a little bit more like a set of steer horns than they really look like a secondary set of wings up here. But it forms, I was talking about the ridges, the shelves inside the skull. So the petrous part was the posterior most shelf. The lesser wing of the sphenoid bone forms that upper ridge. So I call this the cab over area, like this was a camper, right? This lesser wing forms that second taller ridge in the skull. The optic canal is the passageway through which the optic nerve travels. And if you think about where the sella turcica is, you can see these holes that light is coming through. And I've put the stick through one of them. That is the optic canal, or optic foramen, being the opening to that passageway. And if I put the stick through it and I turn this around, it's sort of positioned between the sella turcica and the lesser wing. If I turn this around, the optic canal, if you look at the orbit, which is the opening to the eye, that optic canal is a perfectly round hole. And I've got the stick coming out of it now, but I'll back that out so you can see the hole with light coming through it. So that perfectly round hole at the back of the orbit is the optic canal. And there's a large slit next to it, and we don't learn that feature. Okay, then the sphenoidal sinus is going to be inside the sphenoid bone, and it's actually inferior to the sella turcica. So it's inside the bone below the saddle seat. And so again, you can't see it from an articulated skull, but it's within the sphenoid bone there. Anterior to the sphenoid bone is the ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone forms the core of your nose. Your nose is essentially built around the sphenoid bone and several other bones, as we'll talk about before the skull is covered. But the ethmoid bone makes up the core of the nose. And you can see a good bit of it from this top view where we're sort of looking at the top of the nose. And then I'll show you some other views as well. But there is a crest in the very center, a ridge that is smooth and sticks up. And this is called the Crista Galli, which means crest of the chicken. So it's like a rooster's mohawk. And then on either side of that, and not very large, I'll kind of bring it closer to the camera so you can maybe see, is some bone that has a whole bunch of little holes going through it. And these holes are so tiny that I can hardly get the stick to stay in one of them. And there are a whole bunch of holes, a large amount of holes, I should say. So they're referred to as foramina, the plural version of one hole. Cribriform foramina is one option, and the other option is olfactory foramina. These are the holes through which your olfactory nerves go from your brain into the top part of your nostrils and your nasal cavities to detect odor chemicals. The bone that surrounds all these little holes is called the cribriform plate. And so the Crista Galli is the smooth ridge in the center. The holes on either side are called the cribriform foramina, or you can call them olfactory foramina. Olfactory means smell. And then the bone surrounding the holes is the cribriform plate. On an exam, it would be nearly impossible to separately point to the holes versus the bone. And it's going to be the wording of the question that's going to separate those two different answers. So read the questions carefully always. So those are the features that you can see from the superior view. And then this makes the core of the nose. So we're going to kind of look up the nose of this skull to look at the other features of the ethmoid bone. And we'll start with the perpendicular plate. And this model shows a lot of these things very well, but the nasal septum here is very curved for whatever reason. Nasal septum is not a term that's in the lab manual, but a septum is a wall, a divide between two separate areas. So dividing your left and right nostrils is your nasal septum. And the upper half of that nasal septum is the feature of the ethmoid bone that is called the perpendicular plate. And it is not looking quite perpendicular in this model because it's a little curved for whatever reason. But the perpendicular plate is right in the middle, and it's very narrow. And if you think about, I'm going to kind of draw the cribriform plate kind of runs sideways in a transverse direction up in the top view of the skull up here. The perpendicular plate is perpendicular to that, so it's hanging down from that plate. And with the Crista Galli sticking up above the cribriform plate, all together those features make the shape of a cross, or an exaggerated plus sign, if you will. Okay, so the perpendicular plate extends downward and is the top half of the nasal septum, right in the middle if you look up the nose. Okay, and then on either side of the perpendicular plate are large masses of bony material. And try to make this easier for me to show you up the nose. So I have the stick touching one, and then there's another on the other side of the perpendicular plate. So these are lateral in the superior portion of the nose hole, looking up the nose. These are the ethmoidal labyrinths, or you can call them lateral masses. They are masses of bone that make surface area that are lateral to the perpendicular plate. So either term, ethmoidal labyrinth or lateral mass. And then if you were to open up the ethmoidal labyrinths or lateral masses, you would find kind of a honeycomb pattern of hollowed out spaces inside this portion of the ethmoid bone that makes the ethmoidal sinuses, and there are multiple on each side. And these also can be called air cells. So quite a few alternative terms related to the ethmoid bone.